Welcome back. In this session, we are going to continue our discussion of themes, and we are going to discuss the partisan politics of the 1790s and the theme of anarchy versus tyranny in Brown's Whelan. So in 1798, John Adams, a Federalist, was president, and Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican, was vice president. It's the only time in American history that people of different political parties shared the two highest offices of the national government. The election of 1796 was the first truly contested election up to that point. According to the original Constitution, the candidate with the highest number of votes, Adams, became president, and the runner-up, Jefferson, became vice president. The hope was that this system would prevent partisanship from dominating American politics. It did not work. The ideological debates between these two parties began in the first congressional session of 1789, only to have intensified throughout the 1790s. And this came to a head in the bitter election between Adams and Jefferson in 1800. Although the setting of Whelan is much earlier, the novel does not seem to be manifestly about American politics, but most scholars read this novel as deeply informed by the partisan battles of the 1790s. Now, the disputes between these two parties were complex, but we can simplify them by making the larger arguments here. Whelan is wrestling with these political arguments. The credo of the Federalist Party, as made clear by their name, is the necessity for a strong federal or national government. They believe that the United States would only thrive if the individual states constituted a unified nation. The first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, was the architect of the Federalist Party's ambitions and doctrine. He designed a finance system that would nourish a national government. By contrast, the core belief of the Democratic Republican Party was the importance of state sovereignty. Its members believed that a powerful national government threatened the sovereignty of the people, whose power was necessarily located at a more local level. Now you see the issue. Another way of understanding this is to identify what each party understood to be the biggest threat to the success of a new nation. For the Federalists, the threat of anarchy and disorder was their main political concern. In their opinion, only a strong government could provide the resources to help the United States thrive. And too much conflict between individual states would lead inevitably to balkanization that would destroy the nation. Now, this concept of balkanization means a fragmentation of a larger region or state into smaller regions or states, which then become hostile and uncooperative with each other. It's usually caused by differences in ethnicity, culture, religion, some other sort of past grievance, and the term is pejorative. This comes out of the division in the Balkan Peninsula in the 19th century, which is ruled almost entirely by the Ottoman Empire at this time. And they break down into smaller states in 1817 and through 1912, and it comes into common usage in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. So, would this term be used by Adams? Possibly, but certainly the theory was well known to the founding fathers. For the the Democratic Republicans, the threat was of a tyrannical authority. They believed that an overly powerful federal government would be no different than a monarchy. And this was from which the U.S. had just secured independence. So this dispute also helps explain the very different responses to the French Revolution and the conflict between England and France. For the Federalist Party, the regicide of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, and then the wide-scale reign of terror, of executions, arrests, was proof that their worries about a dangerous potential of democracy, for them, France was evidence for why a representative government placed power in the hands of the elite was necessary. The French Revolution demonstrated how easily democracy could become what they called a mobocracy, ruled by mob. Now, the Democratic Republican Party was more tolerant of the violence in France, and they accused the Federalists of betraying not only their former allies in the French, but democracy itself. Many Democratic Republicans accused the Federalists of being much too quick to engage in diplomatic relations with their former enemy, Great Britain. On many occasions, there were accusations that the Federalists, and in particular Hamilton, were secretly trying to transform the American Republican government into a constitutional monarchy. So this antagonism between the two political parties escalated with the conflict in Great Britain and France during the French Revolutionary Wars. So the Alien and Sedition Acts passed during John Adams' presidency in 1798, the same year that Wieland was published, were particularly a source of this conflict. These controversial laws had two objects, and they were both partisan. First, the legislation made it harder for new immigrants to the United States to become citizens by extending residency requirements. Most opponents of the law believed that the new requirements were only designed to limit new Democratic Republican voters, since many new immigrants were more likely to become Democratic Republicans, thus reducing Federalist power. Second, the legislation provided in the federal government with power to punish political enemies. It authorized the deportation of non-citizens who were declared dangerous or from an enemy nation. It also criminalized the idea of false statements made critical of the government. Opponents believed the law violated the First Amendment of the Constitution. Scholars agree that Wieland represents this political tumult. We can read the novel as something like an allegory for this disillusionment that happened after the founding of the United States. Just like we can read this as a Gothic novel or in the other themes we've discussed already, the differences between rational and religious thought. So looking at it with that viewpoint, our original four, Clara, Wieland, Pleyel, and Catherine, represent the new United States. I know, might be a stretch. Doesn't matter. ACDEC wants us to look at it this way. So, that doesn't mean that these are the strains of political ideals coming through our characters, maybe not expressly the Adams-Jefferson conflict, but still a conflict emerging out of the new country. So, they're isolated from outside strife, like the United States, isolated from Europe. They're happy, they're educated, wealthy, overconfident about their security. Their little utopian community is destroyed, however, when Carwin enters the scene. It's always Carwin's fault. Carwin represents both a domestic and a foreign threat. We learn that he is from Pennsylvania, but he's also linked to both Spain and Ireland. So, the United States should not imagine itself in this reading as safe from either foreign threats or domestic threats. Maybe a stretch, but at least entertain that idea. In this allegorical reading, it's not entirely clear what Brown suggests. It's ambiguous, which is a literary term. Ambiguity doesn't necessarily need to be conclusive. So, this has caused considerable debate among scholars and what the novel represents. Doesn't matter to us. All we care about is looking at it from all these viewpoints. So, Tyranny or Anarchy presents the greatest danger to good governance. On one hand, we can read it that Wieland's actions as confirming the danger of tyranny. The novel can be read then as a cautionary tale against blind obedience to authority. Wieland should not have obeyed the command to do something that he knows is morally repellent, killing all of his family. According to this reading, Brown would be aligning himself with the Democratic Republicans and their attack on authoritarian assumptions of the Federalists. Scholars who take that position often point to the fact that Brown delivered a copy of his novel to then Vice President Thomas Jefferson. And they propose that Brown sent the novel to Jefferson, assuming that the Democratic Republican Vice President would appreciate the novel's political argument. Other critics suggest that the primary cause of Wieland's actions is not obedience to tyranny, but the anarchy and chaos caused by Carwin. Clara makes that argument herself in the novel. She knows that Wieland is a murderer, and she holds Carwin primarily responsible. She initially thinks that Carwin impersonated God and commanded Wieland to kill. Even after she's finally convinced that Carwin is innocent of that charge, she nevertheless thinks Carwin's ventriloquism caused so much confusion and misunderstanding that it made her brother susceptible to the belief that he had heard God's voice. Therefore, the community is not imperiled by tyrannical authority, but rather by giving too much power to people who are unable to govern themselves. According to this interpretation, the novel is aligned with Federalist anxieties about social violence that comes when authority is not held responsible. These critics often point to the fact that Carwin has escaped from a Dublin jail and therefore is associated with Ireland. Irish immigrants, in particular, became targets of the Alien and Sedition Acts because many of them arrived to the U.S. in the aftermath of the Irish Rebellion in 1798. New immigrants had escaped the failed revolution for Irish independence against British rule, and they were then more likely to vote Democratic Republicans than with Federalists, who are depicted as more sympathetic to Great Britain. Federalist newspapers often depicted these Irish immigrants as dangerous radicals, comparing them to the French Jacobins. According to this reading, then, Brown is supporting the Federalist Party and the Alien and Sedition Acts because he is illustrating the terrifying dangers giving ordinary people and foreigners too much power. Now, these scholars are never going to agree how to read this political argument Brown is making in Wieland. And maybe that's the most significant debate, is that both readings are tenable. The novel offers a critique of both parties. The real risk then here is that good governance is at risk to partisan extremes on either side. And that's what we should take from this. Just recognizing that theme of anarchy versus tyranny and the two political parties at the time, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. So, that ends this session of discussion of the themes. So, thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. Later.